There are moments in life when the silence feels so heavy you can barely breathe. You have prayed. You have believed. You have held on with trembling hands to a promise that sometimes felt like it was slipping through your fingers. And somewhere in the quiet of your room, in the darkness after everyone else has gone to sleep, you have asked the question that you were almost afraid to whisper out loud. God, are you still there? God, did you hear me? God, have you forgotten about me? If that is where you are today, I want you to stop everything you are doing right now. Because what I am about to share with you is not just a message. It is a word that was meant to find you in this exact moment of your life. I have stood before thousands of people over the course of my life, in great stadiums and in small churches, on hillsides and in halls filled with broken human beings looking for something real. And in all of those years, in all of those faces, there is one thing I have learned to recognize more than anything else. I have learned to recognize the face of someone who is tired of waiting, someone whose faith has been stretched so thin that they can see right through it, someone who loves God deeply but quietly wonders if God has somehow looked past them. You are not alone, and your waiting is not wasted. I want to talk to you today about something that most people are afraid to talk about honestly, and that is the wilderness. Not the wilderness you read about in a geography book. I mean that spiritual, emotional, deeply painful place that every serious follower of Christ eventually walks through. That season in your life where the doors keep closing, where the prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling, where the people you thought would stand with you have quietly stepped away, where the finances are not working, where the marriage feels more like a struggle than a sanctuary, where the body is tired and the doctor's report was not the one you were hoping for, where you have done everything you know to do, and you have done it with sincerity, with tears, with fasting, with scripture, and still the breakthrough has not come. That is the wilderness. And I want to tell you something about the wilderness that changed my understanding of the way God works. The wilderness is not a sign that God has abandoned you. The wilderness is where God does his deepest work. I think about Moses. Here was a man who had a burning desire in his heart to do something great for God. He had position, he had influence, he had a palace. And in one passionate, misguided moment, he tried to make things happen in his own strength. And the next thing Moses knew, he was on the backside of the desert, tending sheep for 40 years. 40 years. Can you imagine how that felt? Can you imagine the silence of those desert mornings? The questions that must have haunted him in the evenings. Did I miss my purpose? Was I ever chosen at all? Did I dream it? Or was that calling real? And then one ordinary day, on what must have felt like the 10,000th ordinary day, something was burning. Something was on fire, and it was not being consumed. And the voice of God spoke out of the fire and said, Moses, take off your shoes. The place where you are standing is holy ground. 40 years in the wilderness. And God showed up on an ordinary Tuesday. I want you to hear that, because you have been waiting for God to show up on a Sunday in a great moment with trumpets and visible signs. But sometimes, beloved, God shows up on a Tuesday, on the most ordinary, unremarkable day of your life, when you least expect it, when you have almost stopped looking. That is when the burning bush appears. There is a woman I think about often. I will not tell you her name, but I knew her story. She had prayed for her son for 23 years. 23 years of watching him walk away from God, walk into destruction, make choices that tore her heart apart at the seams every single time she got the news. She prayed when she had the strength to pray, and she prayed when she was too tired to form the words properly. She just knelt and wept and trusted that God could interpret tears. People around her said, maybe you need to accept reality. People said, you have done everything you can. People said, some people just do not come back. She said, I do not care what it looks like. I know what God promised me. On a Thursday evening, her son called her from 3 states away. He was sitting in the parking lot of a church he had wandered into almost by accident, and he was weeping. He said, Mom, something happened to me tonight. I cannot explain it, but I think God found me 23 years of holding on. And God moved on a Thursday evening in a church parking lot in a city she had never even visited. Your waiting is not wasted. Every single prayer you have ever prayed has been heard. Every tear you have shed in the privacy of your bedroom, God has collected them. The scripture says he keeps them in a bottle. Not one of them has been lost. Not one of them has been forgotten. I know you are tired. I am not going to stand here and pretend that the waiting is easy, because it is not. Nobody tells you when you first come to faith that following Christ will take you through seasons that feel like they will break you in half. Nobody puts that on the brochure. But the men and women of Scripture, the ones we call heroes of faith, almost every single one of them had a season of waiting that felt unbearable. Abraham waited 25 years for the son God promised him. 25 years of looking at his aging body, looking at his wife Sarah's aging body, and choosing every single morning to believe that God meant what he said. That is not a small thing. That is not easy faith. That is the kind of faith that has been hammered on the anvil of silence and uncertainty, and has come out on the other side stronger than it was when it went in. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers. He was sold into slavery. He served faithfully and was falsely accused and thrown into prison. He interpreted a dream for a man and asked him simply, please remember me when you get out. And that man forgot him for 2 full years. 2 years. Joseph sat in that prison cell and had every human reason to believe that God had allowed him to fall through the cracks of history. And then, in a single day, everything changed. In a single day, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. In a single day, the word that God had planted in him through a dream as a 17-year-old boy, that word came to pass with such sudden, overwhelming power that Joseph wept so loudly that all of Egypt could hear him. That is the God we serve. That is the God who is watching over your life right now. I want to speak very directly to someone who is reading or listening to these words today, and you are in a place of deep disappointment. You had a dream. You believed it was from God. You stepped out in faith, and it fell apart. And the falling apart did not happen quietly. It happened publicly, and people saw it, and some of them talked about it. And now there is not just disappointment in your heart. There is shame. There is that terrible combination of pain and humiliation that makes a person want to pull away from everything and everyone, including God. I want to say something to you that I need you to really receive. A delayed promise is not a denied promise. A setback in God's hands is not the same as a setback in human hands. When God allows something to fall apart, it is often because he is getting ready to rebuild it in a way that is so far beyond what you originally imagined that you will one day look back and say, Lord, if you had given me what I asked for back then, I would have missed what you were actually preparing for me. That is not a platitude. That is the pattern of Scripture. That is the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. God specializing in the broken, the barren, the forgotten, the passed over, and the pressed down. Those are not the people God avoids. Those are the people God seeks out. Those are the ones he calls by name and says, I have not forgotten you. I know exactly where you are. I have not taken my eyes off of you for a single moment. The psalmist knew this anguish. David, the man after God's own heart, wrote these words in the depths of his own wilderness. He said, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? Those are not the words of a man with a weak faith. Those are the words of a man who loved God so much that the distance felt like agony. And God did not rebuke him for those words. God preserved those words in the eternal Scripture so that every person throughout all of human history who has ever felt forgotten could read them and know they were not alone in feeling that way. If David could cry out, how long, you can too. If the great patriarch Abraham could laugh at God's promise out of sheer disbelief, at one point you can too. God is not fragile. He can handle your honest questions. He can handle your tears. He can handle your wrestling. What he asks is that you do not let go. There is a story in the book of Genesis that has always moved me deeply. Jacob is alone by a river in the middle of the night. He is frightened. He is uncertain. He is facing one of the most overwhelming situations of his life. And in the darkness, a man appears and begins to wrestle with him. They wrestle all through the night. And Jacob, with every ounce of his human strength, holds on. As the morning is beginning to break, the man says, let me go, for the day is breaking. And Jacob says something remarkable. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I want to live in that sentence for a moment. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Here is a man in the dark, in the middle of a spiritual battle, exhausted, hip out of joint, barely standing, and instead of releasing his grip, he tightens it. Instead of walking away from God in his pain and confusion, he presses deeper in. And the response he received was not a rebuke. The response was a name change. You will no longer be called Jacob. You will be called Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Your wrestling is not a sign of spiritual weakness. Sometimes your wrestling is the very thing that God is using to transform who you are and to position you for what he has prepared. The person you will be after this season of waiting, after this season of struggle, after this midnight wrestling, will not be the same person you were when you entered it. God does not waste wilderness seasons. He uses them to build the character that is capable of carrying the blessing he intends to give. I think about the disciples sitting in that upper room after the crucifixion. Everything they had believed, everything they had given up to follow Jesus, everything they had hoped for, it had ended in the most terrible, public, devastating way possible. He was gone. The cross had happened, and they were locked in a room, trembling, confused, devastated, wondering what it had all meant. Had they been deceived? Had it been real? 3 days. 3 days of the most profound, suffocating silence in human history. And then the stone was rolled away, and the man who had been dead was walking. And the women ran from the tomb with a message that sounded too good to be true. And when the disciples finally encountered the risen Christ, the scripture says their grief turned to joy. Not slowly, not gradually. The text implies it was sudden. It was overwhelming. The sorrow of 3 days did not disappear piece by piece. It was flooded with resurrection life all at once. That is the picture of what God is about to do in your life. You have been in your own Friday. You have been in your